Hello and welcome to Wrestling and Everything Coast to Coast with your host, Buddy Sotelo Esquire, and effervescent Mike Leno and effervescent Evan Ginsberg. I'll give you both the same nickname for this week. And would you like to introduce our guest tonight, Mike?
We have two outstanding author friends, Richard Vicek and Stephen Verrier. Amazing, amazing authors, historians. I mean, it just goes without saying, their books and their work belong in everybody's library and everybody's Hall of Fame, etc. So it's an exciting show. Great to see two legends of literature back on the show.
Well, we appreciate that.
So in particular, you wanted to tell us about your new book that you have coming out. So why don't you tell our audience a little bit more about the new book that you have?
Well, I will kick that off. The book actually is out. It is I would say, a long overdue biography of Wilbur Snyder, who unfortunately is not as well remembered as many wrestlers who didn't have 1/10 the impact Wilbur did, especially in the 1950s, but all the way through the early 80s. So I've been honored to work on this project with Richard, and we were at it for the research writing for the most part took a year and a half or so, and then we had other business. But the book is available through Crowbar Press at crowbarpress.com.
Scotty Teal, who does an amazing job, one of the most amazing publishers out there. The books look every bit, I mean, they're amazing. I should say Richard is so interesting because I remember working with him on one of my favorites, of course, Major History in Los Angeles, some good, some colorful, in Dick the Bruiser. But the two guys that were running the show for the WWA, which got birthed, I mean, Bruiser kind of took that. We've seen that happen with other territories, but Richard took the LA WWA and made it his own, and it continued. Actually, I think it lived longer, Rich, than the Los Angeles, version, which was really important at that time. And where else were you going to see Dick the Bruiser and Blassie? And Bruiser had a lot of classic matches there, but Wilbur Snyder was like just solid gold in Los Angeles too. So it's neat, that you guys are collectively on this, and all of the Kaniski book, the Pacific Northwest book by Stephen, just amazing stuff. Gordienko. And Richard, did you write some of these other books, non-wrestling books, prior to your first one, which was the Pacific Northwest?
My only writings were individual profiles of WWA people in Slam. That was it, under Greg Oliver.
So and Spike Huber, but there was many. I mean, Pepper Gomez, who lived, you guys know, I think Richard does. Pepper Gomez lived 3 blocks from me in Alameda on Santa Clara Boulevard with his last wife, Bonnie, who we looked after when Pep passed. But man, what a lot of history there. And the video, I don't mean to belabor the Dick the Bruiser, but Wilbur Snyder is on this. And the video that remains from the WWA, when in its heyday, particularly in the 70s, the amazing territory work is, Bruiser's territory. And then I'll shut up about Bruiser because we're hyping Wilbur Snyder's book, the great Wilbur Snyder. But the territory war, and you guys know, early to mid 70s, we had the Montreal Grand Prix versus the Vachon La Lutte, which became international. And then in Atlanta, that battle, Annie Gunkel, Ray's widow, taking on the whole NWA office, which was amazing. But the most colorful one was right in Detroit when Bruiser came from the hub in Indianapolis, taking on the Sheik. And then when victory by the Sheik was, declared, then appearing and doing all of those things, and then the matches with the Sheik, but just amazing stuff. Wilbur had history, globally, and I'm sure you guys can talk. I'm kind of forgetting now his history in Japan, if there was one. I'm pretty sure there had to have been.
He did wrestle in Japan, not until well into his career, but he had a few good runs there. He and Danny Hodge were tag team champions for a time. And when I talked to Koji Yamamoto, from his perspective, Wilbur Snyder in Japan was treated, as one of those top shelf guys, like a Karl Gotch or a Blassie or, others of that caliber who made a big impact in Japan. So Wilbur did well there.
Wilbur, and I'll shut up here, but I think he was one of the very first, along with Gene Kiniski, to bop between Northern and Southern California, which were totally unrelated. At times they shared talent, but Wilbur was a big deal for Shire when he got going. He pushed Joe Malkowitz's very aggressive takeover in 1960, and he was just subsisting on other people's TV, including that of the Sheik and Stu Hart, before he ever promoted his first show in '61. But he'd already pushed Joe Malkowitz out of the equation. Malkowitz had used Wilbur and to great success, and then Wilbur, like Pepper Gomez, was huge as a face, like the Romeros and the Torreses in Los Angeles.
Yeah, Wilbur was certainly impactful in the north and in the south of California. Of course, he started in the south, did very well, but you just couldn't keep him there for long.
So can you tell us some of the things? I don't want you to spoil your book, but tell us some of the things that you learned about Wilbur Snyder that you did not know before you started researching this book. I'll throw it over to Richard first.
Well, Steve and I divided Wilbur's life we divided the project at the start of 1964. But prior to that, Wilbur had been working as an independent wrestler, traveling all across the country. And I didn't realize, because I had always just knew Wilbur from my own backyard, how frequently and how often he moved around the country from 1953 to 1963. And he brought his family along, and his late son, Mike Snyder, gave me this list of states, which I will read off: California, Illinois, Texas, Illinois, California, back to Indiana, Minnesota, California, the Indiana, and I left out Ontario. That's how often his family moved during those formative years. I had no clue. I had very little clue, other than some old wrestling magazines, about Wilbur prior to forming the partnership with Dick. And maybe Steve can let you in on some of the highlights from those first 10 years.
Yeah, I'll start by saying that my introduction to Wilbur Snyder many years ago was when he was already in Indianapolis. So, I watched from my home base in Southern Ontario at that time, and I saw a very capable middle-aged wrestler. I knew nothing of his co-ownership of the promotion, but I saw a very good wrestler in his 40s. And it really wasn't until probably when I was working on the Kiniski book that I really realized what an impactful wrestler Wilbur was during that first decade of his career. I saw him 15 or 20 years into his career, but from 53 until he settled down in Indianapolis a decade later, he was one of the very top wrestlers in the United States, and of course in the world, you could say. He started facing guys like Joe Pazendak and Baron Michel Leone and other pretty top guys just months into his career. He did well, but of course Lou Thesz played a major role in putting him on the map. But from that time, Snyder was an absolutely top wrestler for a solid decade. And, I didn't know that until I worked on the Kiniski book because, well, Wilbur was Gene Kiniski's very close friend, even beyond their years living in the same places, the same territories. So through researching Kiniski's life, and I think Richard had a similar experience when he researched Brucer's life, we saw just what a top guy Wilbur Snyder was in the 50s. And I think a lot of people like me, or at least as I used to, remember Snyder more for what he did in Indianapolis when he was, a 40-year-old, still capable wrestler, but one who would put over the top talent coming into that territory to support the business. That was his priority. He didn't care, I think, whether he won or lost nearly as much as whether he did the right thing for the promotion. So to me, the most surprising thing was just realizing that, when you look in the 1950s and early 60s, sure, you've got Buddy Rogers, you've got Lou Thez, Vern Gagne, Hans Schmidt, but you better put Wilbur Snyder in that same category. So when I realized that, and when Richard kind of suggested, why don't we work on this project, I was all for it. I mean, Snyder is absolutely due a serious biography.
And during those years, those first 10 years, Wilbur had countless matches with Dick the Bruiser and Vern Gagne in multiple Midwest cities. And them getting to know each other would really pay dividends years later when they became not only the star wrestlers, but the star wrestlers of their own promotion. So they were the star and executive producer at the same time.
Evan, do you have any questions?
Yes. Dr. Mike and I are working on a book on John Tolos, and what I find is a lot of the younger fans will go, "Who?" So going in, we know we're not going to get rich from this, and we know we're not going to sell mountains and mountains of books. So Mike was a dear friend of John Tolos. Mike was a pallbearer for John Tolos. So I understand, and I was a huge, huge fan who grew up on him and saw him weekly on TV here in New York because we got the LA tapings. And I saw him wrestle Bruno at the Garden. So if you ask me what's our rationale for doing this, it's obviously not money. So my question to you guys is, similarly, there's not a million fans out there who would even know who Wilbur Snyder is at this point. What is your motivation for doing a book that involves countless hours, research, blood, sweat, tears? I know the process of writing books because I've done several. What is your motivation?
Well, I'll just chime in. It's spreading the word. It's that Brucer Snyder promotion I watched as a kid. I went to the International Amphitheater in 1966 when they just started the Chicago Wrestling Club with Verns, Dick, and Wilbur. And that was ingrained into me at a very young age. And I always tried to convince people of other territories who never grew up with this what an exciting chapter it was in wrestling in Chicago with Bob Luce as the promoter.
Was he, can I ask you, I think people will be totally interested internationally, particularly in Japan, where they're just ravenous for history. But was Bob Luce sort of I wouldn't say conduit or figurehead, but it was like behind the scenes, Brucer, Wilbur, and Gagne were pretty much doing everything, but he was the on-camera guy, was hosting the show and involved in angles and things like that. Am I correct on that?
Yes, and he was involved with all the logistics at those amphitheater shows and the spot shows that Brucer did in the Chicago suburbs. Having the ring there, making sure, by the way, another town in his little world was Hammond, Indiana.
Oh, Tiny Tim Hampton's, wasn't that where
Yeah.
he was billed from?
Yes. So, and Bob Luce had his own television show starting in 1971 on Channel 44, WSNS TV. It was like a talk show Star Trek set. And he'd interview people, and of course, the interviews were staged to have some kind of publicity stunt. Heenan shoving a cigar at Pepper Gomez, or Sergeant Jack Goulet banging Moose Cholak with a board. But he was the man behind the scenes that made that Chicago wrestling club move. And from 1966 to 83, he really made that a very valuable franchise in Chicago. And he was literally, I think the secretary treasurer of that organization. Of course, none of those three star wrestlers, were officers or owners, but, they controlled the whole thing. Bob Luce may have been the general manager, but he knew, well, the only way I'm going to get stars on the show is playing ball with Dick, Wilbur, and Vern.
I got to tell you, the most exciting, I loved that venue. I should probably dig out my shots of me in front of the amphitheater, me in front of the ring. The last time I was shooting there was, I think it was either 75 or 77. It was 2 out of 3 where Ray and Nick dropped the straps to Bruiser and Crusher. But underneath that was the match I wanted to see, because I was such a Wilbur and Billy Robinson mark. And I think it was the Valiant's debut. Maybe not, but they wrestled, because they had just come and I had traveled with them. They left Vince Sr. for the first time. And, the first place we went to was Champaign, Illinois. But then the amphitheater was like a couple of weeks later. Mike Ratchner drove me there. Anyway, after a tornado in wherever he was in Illinois. And that venue just was, I put it up there with Madison Square Garden and Korakuen and in Japan and some of the others. But the match was great because you could tell Billy and Wilbur could have tied those guys in knots, Jimmy and John, very quickly, but they made the match entertaining. And being such a Wilbur and Billy Robinson mark, I was just in heaven seeing that. And then at that venue with that audience, it was really magic. And I think on that card too, if I'm not mistaken, I get to see Ray Stevens and Pat O'Connor in like a 20-minute Broadway. It's just like amazing stuff. And then Bob Luce, and I'll shut up, but big Bob Luce mark, because it's so colorful. He had sent me whenever it came out, the 4 videotape. I'm sure you guys have it, of all of the crazy stuff. Pepper Gomez getting who was it now? Because I'm forgetting, because they recreated that in Australia with Keller Kowalski. Was it Stevens that dove off the ladder, after a series of guys Pepper showing he had the cast iron stomach.
Yes.
They
Chicago,
do that. It was most famously in Chicago, but they recreated it with Kowalski coming off the ladder onto Pepper, his neck instead of his stomach.
On Bob Luce's show, they rolled a Volkswagen onto his stomach. He was on the ground. They rolled the Volkswagen up a ramp, so the car was on his stomach, and he would do push-ups with his stomach with the car. So anyway, that was the Chicago. They didn't do the off the ladder. And so anyway, they did their version of the cast iron stomach work. Yes.
Wasn't it the big angle though? Was it Stevens who did it, and that created the series of matches with Pepper, or was it a different?
I think it was in the San Francisco territory.
Oh, okay, all right.
But
you are so you guys right. Wait.
I remember hearing about it as a kid. I remember hearing about it as a kid, and it was just everyone was completely outraged because remember, as you said, Pepper Gomez. I'm in San Francisco. and that was like the wrestling event that like energized everybody out here. People were, even when they weren't part of
they were going to do Candlestick Park, and I don't know if I've gone over this with Stephen, but I know I've talked with Richard or emailed years and years ago, and that was the first time that Ray got in an accident on his motorcycle, and they had to scrap the Candlestick Park show, which would have been main event, Pepper Gomez and Ray Stevens, whatever year that was, I think 64, 65. And Roy Shire, promoter, was livid. But okay, so there was never that particular angle where, you had a series of like job guys doing it properly, landing on his stomach, but instead the heel, whether it was Stevens in San Francisco or Kowalski in Australia for World Championship Wrestling there, unrelated to the Atlanta-based one or the Ted Turner one. But there was all kinds of insane angles. I mean, and lots of blood, and that's how the 4-tape series that Luce was hyping. He was just way ahead of his time at being kind of sort of like a Carney, Vince McMahon Jr. type guy, but in the 70s, and absolute blast. And when I was doing PR, Evan will remember Ron Scholar, who purchased AAA Lucha Libre shows starting in 92 and had them at the sports arena. Well, we did one, and I was his PR guy, and he flew me in a week early to Chicago, and then New York followed at the Felt Forum, the smaller theater part of Madison Square Garden. But we honored, I told Ron it'd be really cool if we could honor a guy in both Chicago and New York. So we did Morales, and we had Conan and Santo and Octagon present Pedro Morales, at halftime intermission. But I got to present Bob Luce at the Lucha Libre show at the UAC, whatever year that was. And his son was there, great guy after we lost Bob. But that was a big thrill for me because there are certain guys like Wild Red Berry or Jules Strongbow that, you feel like you're in the presence of a god or just a really great, colorful guy that there's only one of in the universe, and Bob Luce was one of them. So I hope, and I'm sure he plays a great role in this book. And for Bob Luce marks, they're going to want to read this book, or Pepper marks, or if you're a historian and you really love wrestling, you're going to want to get all of the books both of you have put out. Obviously, Dick the Bruiser, there was nobody like. He was the first no-sell guy before the Road Warriors, and influenced so many guys, and it was just magic. And I don't think Chicago is always. It should be remembered because that amphitheater was a palace, an amazing venue. The site of wasn't that the site of? I think there were no shootings prior to what was it? The Bockwinkel Gagne match.
Yes, January 1975. That was
huge. That was huge. That reverberated. It was on, we got nothing. There were very few until Andre went on the Tonight Show, and Carson wasn't even there that first time. Or, a few of the others like Jack Benny having Gene LaBelle and having, I think that it was Count Billy Varga who he wrestled Jack Benny on that one. But we never got mainstream or until, the Dick Lane with the Raquel Welch Kansas City Bomber roller derby movie. We never got, that's the sister sport to wrestling. We never got any mainstream. We have it now, but that shooting at the Chicago Amphitheater in '75 was huge. I'll shut up because I'm sure. Ev, do you remember? You must have heard about that or read about it in like Norm Keitzer's mags, as that was the topic of. That was a huge deal. It was a negative deal, but thankfully nobody got hurt, and the gunman got away. Right.
I'm finding now that everywhere I go, they're checking for weapons. Oh, really?
I just wanted to add 2 of the wounded people from the Gagne Bockwinkel shooting declined interviews for the Wilbur Snyder book.
Wow, it's
I had all the newspaper clips, and I had their names. One's in Michigan, one's in suburban Chicago. but they didn't respond, and I understand, but I couldn't pass up the opportunity to ask.
I'll tell you a funny shooting story. This is true. This is not a joke. Two indie wrestlers I'm friendly with, they're out of their minds, and I'm not going to say who it is, but they were huddled together, and they were like, why don't you shoot me, but just graze me in the arm, and this would be a great angle. And the promoter saying, what if the bullet ricochets and kills a fan? I mean, they were seriously like huddled together considering this, like it's an option. Can you shoot me and just graze me? I couldn't make it
about like Tommy Dreamer. Tommy Dreamer's admitted he asked Paul Heyman he wanted to do something like that, and obviously it would be well rehearsed and blah blah blah.
That's a different story because I'm talking about two other guys, but yeah.
Tommy Dreamer at ECW, that would be extreme. Stephen, I know I should have pulled these out, and I'm sure you have it covered in the book because when I read it when it came out. But Wilbur had time in Hawaii for Ed Francis, who I consider to be the greatest promoter in Honolulu history. Forget about Leah Maivia, who did draw, but so many problems. I mean, forget about Wilbur Snyder getting some heat for the payoffs. Leah stiffed folks, and even her daughter. I've talked to Ada about it, Rock's mom. But Wilbur had some time in Hawaii, and those cards were stacked when Wilbur was in town.
Yeah, well, I mean, who didn't want to wrestle there in those days? I mean, for a lot of guys, it was simply a stop on the way to Japan, but it was also a destination. It was more than Honolulu, and absolutely, just a dream job for a lot of wrestlers.
And have you heard the story? I've told you this, but Nick and Ray used to love to go to Maui and ride naked on a moped up and down to the Haleakala volcano. And one time they dragged Wilbur. Nick told me this before, sadly he started losing his memory. And Nick had such a vivid memory. And I think they even took Heenan once. And Wilbur was also involved when Ray and Nick, it was Ray and Nick, well, in Honolulu en route to Japan, sometimes roller derby from San Francisco, the Jerry Seltzer, Leo Seltzer derby, which is a global. It wasn't the Los Angeles thing. It was pretty much North America. But anyway, they would have sometimes tours that would entwine between the wrestling and derby in Japan and Honolulu. And it was Honolulu where they took Annie Calvello, who was like the Moolah, the huge heel of the 50s and 60s, and they put a Mickey in Pat Patterson's drink. They put him to bed, and Wilbur, Pat, and Ray, Wilbur, Nick, and Ray and Heenan was I forget the year, but Heenan was hanging around, and they put Annie in bed with Pat, and she was in on the rib, and so, Pat wakes up, he sees a woman in bed with him, he screams, and he would tell the story until his dying day of, the only time he slept with a woman. And it was a conjoined rib by those guys. I know I probably forgot to have relayed that to Stephen unless he'd already heard it.
No, I'm sure I would remember had I heard that.
So Wilbur had a good sense of humor. He wasn't super serious, whereas Bruiser and Crusher, they did have sense of humors, maybe not about themselves so much, maybe more so Crusher, who I think would be thrilled to see this Crusher Fest, which Tommy Dreamer said it drew like 50,000 over the course of a couple of days. They have a statue in Milwaukee. They have a multi-day, 2 to 3 day festival. I don't know if either of you guys went. Rich, maybe you went. But what a big deal for wrestling on a total legend that's not been with us for, X amount of years, the Crusher. And he figures into all of this too. Wilbur's story, Bruiser's story, obviously. What legends. And I think that's why people enjoy the book. And there's so many, stories that revolve about that. How about let's ask the both of you about maybe Wilbur's sense of self or his sense of humor or maybe, because he saw a lot of crazy stuff going on. And then when they lost the Battle of Detroit, having to see Dick and Heenan and Art Thomas go over and appear at Kobo shows, what did you get a sense of how Wilbur felt about all of those things or those events? Because that was, major news at the time.
Well, my understanding in talking to some of the wrestlers that were there, Dick was the dominant person of the territory. For that Detroit thing, my understanding is Wilbur went along for the ride. He did not appear as in the ring on a lot of those shows, but he was there every night working the box office, which many of the photographers who worked the Olympia told me. They were surprised Wilbur wasn't on the card, but he was there working the box office at Olympia Stadium. They were equal partners. I guess Wilbur was more of a cerebral partner and the bookkeeper. He would do business, keep the books, debits and credits every morning. And that was his main contribution to the team. Whereby Wilbur was the one that planned the TV, did the editing, delivered the finishes. They both contributed to who was hired and who was fired. And like for the 250 interviews I did for the Bruiser book and the Snyder book too, the only conflict that anyone ever brought up was over the replacement of Sam Menaker as the TV man, where they had a dispute because Menaker was replaced by David McLean, who was still an undergraduate at the University of Indiana at the time. But interviewing all those people, 110 of them are no longer with us, by the way. Wow. But that's what they said. The only major disagreement they ever had was over the Sam Menaker release. And that happened by Dick when Wilbur was out of town. But I'm just saying they got along pretty good and peacefully for those 18 years in Indianapolis and 17 years in Chicago, of course, with Vern Gagne in Chicago.
Yeah, and I would add that one reason they got along so well, is probably due to the character of Wilbur Snyder. I mean, he did not crave the limelight. His family was his priority, absolutely. And the reason he settled in Indianapolis, he could have continued as a top wrestler far longer than he did had he, put his career first. But the family was first. The business was second. And Wilbur, I think, put himself in third place. So, he certainly knew how to work with Dick the Bruiser. Not everybody could have done it. And very few people, other than a few, I would say, wrestlers who were young and working in Indianapolis and maybe a little impatient or dissatisfied with their places on the cards. Virtually nobody had anything negative to say about Wilbur Snyder. And that's another thing, I think, that drew me to working on this book with Richard. I mean, it became apparent pretty quickly that he was not just a typical wrestler, but a guy with a lot of character and, a sense of purpose. And to him, wrestling was his job. He took it seriously, as he would have taken probably any job he was doing seriously. I mean, he drove a truck for a couple of years, and every indication is that he was a very reliable, hardworking fellow, even when he obviously was not using his athletic skills to the degree he could have. So put all that together, and yeah, he was part of a very, very effective partnership with somebody you wouldn't expect him to to work with or to stay in business with for such a long time. But it went great for them.
How about his ring work, guys? Was there things about what he did in the ring that made him special? I did in my research of Wilbur Snyder, just myself. I read that at least some people credit him with being the man who invented the abdominal stretch, which is a move I absolutely love in wrestling. What do you guys have to say about your research there?
I would say he's the guy who put the finishing touches on that move. I mean, there had been wrestlers using similar stretching maneuvers over the years, but it was Wilbur who made it what we think of. I mean, other people have added touches beyond what Wilbur did. I mean, Inoki, for example. But yeah, Wilbur was the one, I think, you can say, made that move what it was. And one of the really interesting things sticking in my head now was an incident in the ring between Baron von Raschke and Wilbur. I think it was in the aftermath of Raschke's match against Andre the Giant, or Giant Rusimov, in Indianapolis. Andre's first appearance there, and after the match, maybe I'm thinking of a different match, but I think that's the one. After the match, Wilbur, who was in Andre's corner, got into it with Raschke, and they were punching, and then in the middle of what looks like a brawl, Wilbur whips Raschke into the ropes, and he gets him in that abdominal stretch. And, that hold was so over that's when people, I think, really came apart. I mean, okay, look, they're punching. Oh, Wilbur's got him in the stretch. I mean, that just brought things to a different level. So, Wilbur, I think, deserves credit for putting that hold on the map for sure. And I wish we saw it more nowadays.
I never got a chance to ask, just quickly point Wilbur, but Dick Lane used to claim on television that he did come up with some names for holds. Dick Lane was a movie and TV star before he became our lead play-by-play guy in Los Angeles for decades, oftentimes with Jimmy Lennon Sr. doing color, which was it was great stuff. But Dick came up with a name for the monkey flip, but also the abdominal stretch. And he was close to Wilbur Snyder, particularly when Wilbur was there, and rode with him sometimes to some of the towns. I think when Jules was promoting, because there was tussling between different promoters and venues, and I think Jules was primarily at like Long Beach and Santa Monica Civic before the Olympic, when Cal Eaton took over, and blah blah blah. But did either of you guys hear that Los Angeles legendary TV announcer? Every territory had their own great legend, but and Dick was pretty decent. Had you heard that Dick came up with or claimed to have come up with the name for the abdominal stretch on his own?
Oh, but I was aware of Dick Lane from Roller Game of the Week.
But he did three things. It was insane.
Which was syndicated in Chicago,
right,
on what is now the Fox station.
That was the Griffiths. It was Roller Games. Yes. It was more theatric than the Roller Derby, the Seltzer version in San Francisco, which really did have actual satellite teams. They'd be the babyface team in like Montreal. I have those tapes where you can hear overdubbing in French from Dick Lane's commentary. But the one you're talking about, so Dick Lane, on a weekly basis, he was doing weekly Demolition Derby. He was doing Roller Games, and then, of course, wrestling sometimes twice a week on Channel 5. And then when they acquired Channel 13, before Channel 5, they had to go Hispanic and move to Channel 34, which was the syndicated show, started in 1970. But yeah, Dick was doing a ton of stuff. And of course, he's most famous as the police chief in the series of movies Boston Blackie, sort of like the Dead End Kids and they had series of different movies like the Thin Man series. Anyway, so I didn't know.
I didn't know that Lane knew Wilbur at the time of Jules Strongbow, because Wilbur was featured in 1955, I think it was, a full color spread of him wrestling in Ocean Park, California, against none other, Evan, than John Tolos.
Hmm.
And I've captured all that on a PDF. I'll send it to Buddy, who could forward it to Evan.
Oh, thanks
Well,
so
me
much.
too, please. Yeah, me too. I definitely, obviously want to see it because I ran the Tolos Brothers fan club. It was like, I think they had some in the 50s, but a lot of the heels they really didn't have fan clubs. So John and Chris is kind of a big deal.
I inquired with Getty Images. It would have been cost prohibitive to use any of that material. Hundreds of dollars, but you guys will get to see it yourself.
So I have an important question for you guys. Now, Richard was saying he interviewed 250 people, and you were just talking about photographs. And I know some guys are very intrigued to the point of obsessive with digging into microfiche and getting thousands of results, which isn't my thing. But what makes a great wrestling book? When Steve was talking about, Wilbur Snyder's personality and character, I found that particularly interesting because you want to know who this person is and why are they worthy of a book. What do you guys consider what makes a great wrestling book? Because many times wrestling journalism, wrestling alleged journalism is a bombardment of information. And WWE books, it's always some inane angle, Ric Flair talking for 40 pages about some WrestleMania angle, and, he writes 2 paragraphs on Ray Stevens. I'd be more interested in 40 pages of Ray Stevens. You follow? So again, not to be repetitive, what do you consider makes a great wrestling book?
Well, I'll take that one first. As a reader, as much as a writer, I think a good wrestling book is going to appeal in some way to somebody who's not a wrestling fan.
Yeah.
There's got to be more. I mean, when I decided to write on Kaniski, I was fascinated by that Polish immigrant experience in central Alberta. With the Snyder book, we started the story essentially with Wilbur's family's arrival in upstate New York a couple of centuries before Wilbur came into the picture, and then their excursion west into Utah. There still is a community called Snyderville in Utah. So there's got to be more. I have another book coming out very shortly. It's for an academic publisher. It has nothing to do with wrestling. But I take the same approach, whether I'm writing something for a publisher like that or for a publisher that has an audience primarily of wrestling fans. There has to be more. I'd like somebody in a library to pick that up and say, wrestling? Oh, wait, there is something for me. So to me, that is important. So you're not going to write about just anybody. It's got to be somebody who's lived a life that, people are going to care about, or something about wrestling. If you put wrestling in the bigger picture, why were there so many Japanese wrestlers doing this? Well, there's a story behind that, or, you name it. I think you got to make those connections. Otherwise, it's, not to denigrate what we would call just a wrestling book, but I think you can aim a little higher than that.
I wrote down you have to get behind the facade and getting behind the kayfabe storylines. And I tried to get as many quotes and observations from the people who were there. Do you have anything in your files? So I think that's not just so-and-so wrestled in this territory, and a year later went to this territory, and a year and a half let get as much behind the facts, the standard facts as you can get, and dig under any possible rock you can. You know, I think that's a big.
What about the quality of writing itself? I could count on maybe two hands, quote unquote, wrestling writers that I consider writers, because many times these clickbait boys, it's just, robotically, reviewing Raw, obsessively reviewing every angle, every move, every word. And
well, if you ask me, there's a difference between, writing something and reporting it. And I think, people who are reporters tend to think they're writers when they're not really writing or contributing anything other than just regurgitating what literally just happened in front of their own two eyes.
But our two guests do the hard work. They go through the results and the microfiche, and not everybody has to do that, but that's who I have the most respect for, the real historians who bring these guys to life. And our days, ask George Shire Jr. or any of the guys, Dave Brzezinski or Koji or many historians in Japan. These are the guys we want to learn more about, and we hope others will be more interested in Gordienko and Snyder and Dick the Bruiser. I mean, there's nobody like them since, not in today's overly choreographed wrestling, where everybody thinks people that have like absolutely no degrees in journalism never went to, not researchers, and there are all these touted people invited to pressers after WWE pay-per-views. No, I'm kind of more interested in what Richard, Stephen, and other historians, Scotty Teal, who's put out so many incredible books with Crowbar Publishing. And
but while we have a couple minutes left, I do want to ask both of you guys, why do you think that wrestling history doesn't have a tremendous value attached to it, especially to modern viewers, and that the WWE and AEW don't spend a lot of time?
It does with the towns, Chicago, Toronto, Montreal. There's many great cities, St. Louis, where they cherish their wrestling history, and they're not, when Vince Jr. was still around, trying to rewrite history.
Yeah,
Nobody
AEW
would fall
and WWE don't ever foster that. They their ability, their desire to want to, value someone like the Crusher, Dick the Bruiser, or Wilbur Snyder. You never hear about that. So, Richard,
I could give you two words that sums up the attitude: hoss funk.
Yeah.
I understand. I mean, I get what you're getting at, but for the average viewer that doesn't quite get.
Oh, you know why that Haas Funk came about? Finally, Triple H. Somebody asked him, and he's a little more appreciative of history. And when I got to introduce him for his book, whatever it was, like a good 22, whatever it was an exercise book at a Barnes and Noble in San Francisco, and just seeing him beam up when I pulled out, in the back before I introduced him at the signing, my shots of Kowalski in his day, working with Blassie, Tolis, Bruno at the Olympic, and many others, Cowboy Frankie Lane, and blah, blah, blah. So there's an appreciation there, but, by and large, no. So the Haas Funk was because Vince Jr. hated being called Junior. And we all called him Junior because we had such disdain from seeing him, at X amount of the TV tapings in Allentown, et cetera, in the 70s for Vince Sr. And seeing this guy there who was it he replaced? Bruno had a shit fit when Vince Jr. replaced in 71. It was anyway, it was the long time. Bill Cardell. Oh, Ray Morgan. Yeah, not Bill Cardell, but Ray Morgan. So Vince hated the Junior thing, and that's why Dory Jr. became Haas Funk, which was ridiculous because he looked nothing like, nor was he as heavy as the actor who played Haas Cartwright.
But Stephen, what's your thoughts of why the WWE and AEW don't, give any tribute back to where they came from.
We've not established if Richard or Stephen enjoy or watch. Are you guys watching current product? Because a lot of our historian brothers and sisters don't. They just can't stomach it.
I went to an AEW show outside Seattle a couple of weeks ago. And there are capable wrestlers, but, I've got to say the best wrestling I've seen in recent weeks was on television, YouTube. A few days ago, it was Lou Thez and Ray Gonkel.
Yeah.
That's what I gravitate to. I spend part of my time in Japan. I'll be there shortly, and I'm just looking at the Korakuen Hall schedule so I can buy tickets in advance. I mean, I like the current product there because you can see pretty much everything. All the companies go through that little facility, and it's a great place with fans who care. So, it depends. I mean, I don't identify a lot with what's on TV in the States because it is aimed at a young audience that really doesn't care, I think, about what went on in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and maybe has the perspective that, civilization began around the 1980s, which coincides with the WWF expansion. So I think it's just a matter of, deciding what's going to be most lucrative, where the money is, what the audience wants.
One thing you should go to, though, Stephen, if you've been to Japan, like I have, and I don't know if Rich, if you've been there, but there is there were two Ribera's restaurants. Senior put out two. I was at both of them. The newer one it didn't make it. Tiny place, only seated maybe 12 to 14. Usually, always the wrestlers. But the original one, hopefully, they still have the photos of Wilbur and Bruiser and Crusher. Bruiser and Crusher from whenever they won, I think it was the IWE tag titles in '68. And they have. So, Stephen, have you been to Ribera's? You should.
I haven't. In fact, I
it's the wrestling
years
restaurant.
in Japan previously. Yeah, I'm well aware. Maybe this summer I'm going to try to get there. Yeah, but I haven't been there.
I'll hook you up because there've been people talking and only a wrestler deserves it. Well, my editor at Gong Magazine, Wally Yamaguchi, who later became a managing performer in WWF in the mid, 94, 95, Evan, as Yamaguchi's son. But anyway, when he first took me in 1990, Ribera himself, Senior, gave me one of the jackets, but he also gives you a wristwatch, an alarm clock that says Ribera's, all into gimmicks, a T-shirt. So don't think that you don't deserve it. If you go and Ribera Jr. gives you any of those things, definitely take them because it's a prestigious thing. But typically the wrestlers think the only people that deserve the ring Ribera jackets are wrestlers, and I agree, but I never wore mine out in public. But hopefully, I'll try to hook you up with that because it is an experience to see all of the history at this wrestling restaurant. Photos of all of those icons, and Gagne's in there, Robinson, Gotch, and Dr. Big Bill Miller. All of our heroes are in there. Bert Asariti, even with photos. So, and on up to today's folks. The Kenny Omegas and the Will Ospreys. So I think the experience for either Richard or Stephen, of today's at least, is to go to a New Japan show at Korakuen or the Tokyo Dome or any of those venues there.
I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, I don't know yet which companies. I mean, I still have the the website up in the background. But yeah, I'm planning to try to get tickets for some events during the summer there. And New Japan is certainly high on the list.
They still have the shoot groups. There's still like 37 to 38 groups. There's like 9 women's groups alone.
Yeah.
The shoot groups that claim to be shoot with worked finishes, sort of the way Takada and Akira Maeda had back in the 90s when they left New Japan formed these shoot groups, but a lot of the shoots were not. But they're only now getting word out that they had choreographed finishes, just like our biz.
Yeah, anyway, I think that's the best wrestling facility in the world. I mean, on the 5th floor of this unassuming building in the shadow of the Tokyo Dome. I remember interviewing a wrestler once, and he was trying to give me directions on how to sneak into shows in Korakuen Hall. I mean, he talked about the hallways and, the secret doors, and I don't remember what else, but I'll gladly buy tickets to go there.
Wonderful. So we're at the end of the hour, fellas. Very, very exciting and very fun to hear about your book. Why don't you guys both give our fans your social media contacts and any information about how they can purchase this book and your other books that we've mentioned on the show?
With me, everything's with Crowbar Press. And I just want to close that Wilbur was a stud of a scientific wrestler in the 50s to 60s. He was a respected promoter in Chicago and Indianapolis. In Indy, him and Bruiser are the ones that hired David McLean and Bobby Heenan, and they also created the teams for the first time of the Blackjacks and the Valiant Brothers.
Yep.
Want to get that in there.
All right, and I can be found at Stephen with a V, Verrier, Verrier, StephenVerrier.com. I'm on Facebook. I'm the good-looking guy, it says, from Seattle. Again, the book is available via crowbarpress.com, and you'll find a lot more than our book when you get there. I mean, there's plenty else and a lot of good reading for you at crowbarpress.com.
Great. Evan, why don't you give a plug for your book?
Sure. Wrestling rings, blackboards, and movie sets, 100 plus true stories. And if you look behind me, some of the guys we were talking about.
There's the Valiants, Jim and John right there, and Bruno Sammartinos to the far left.
Yeah, they're all in the book. And basically pour my heart out, lost a lot of friends in the business, but it's not just wrestling. And this hat here, Chris Michaels, aka Uncle Billy, longtime wrestler. He was in both UWFs, Bill Watts and Herb Abrams. He was an ECW champion. He's currently wrestling as Uncle Billy. He just had about $10,000 hit for his dog Pudgy. He had a tumor, so we have a GoFundMe for William Pierce, and it's called Help Pudgy Recover, support needed. And this coming Saturday, July 12th, from 1 to 7 p.m., Pals for Pudgy. We have a full concert. We have about a half dozen bands coming. The Shillelagh Tavern, 47-22 30th Avenue, Astoria, New York. There'll be wrestlers, there'll be rockers, there'll be punkers, there'll be drag kings, there'll be drag queens. It's going to be quite the eclectic mix, as we used to say.
You have to give a report on that. You'll have to give a report on that after you go. But and also, did you want to give a tribute out to your friend who you lost this?
Yeah. Yeah, 2 days ago, my friend Ulas Putan, he died. He had pancreatic cancer, 62 years old. Father of 4. Guy worked 3 jobs to care for his kids and pay the mortgage. And I was at the memorial today. I'm shell-shocked. And good guy. And these are the immigrant story. He came from India when he was 17 with nothing, and got an education, built a career, occupational therapist, got married, raised a family, bought a house. This is the embodiment of the American dream. You hear the fear mongering, the invading hordes at the border, and all of this bullshit. And here's a guy. You don't hear these stories. Hardworking, honest guys who, So anyway, R.I.P. Good man.
And Mike, you had something else you wanted to add?
Quickly, the Dropkick Murphys, who are a band, well known. They've done music on different wrestling shows like Lucha Vavoom. Well, they've just released an album, an anti-ice album. Wherever you stand on that, but they are great guys, great human beings, great. They're a punker band. They've been around for decades. But I was going to say this off air, but I'm going to send both Richard and Stephen my shots of Sammy Menaker, who made his way backstage at the very first Eddie Einhorn IWA show. Eddie, I guess, had some thoughts that he might use him on TV, interviewing with Tex McKenzie and Jack Reynolds. It didn't happen, but I posed Sam in a tux, and he and I were talking about June Byers, who I can also send you photos of. But I posed him with Lou Thez, who came to see what was going on, kind of almost spying for Sam Munchnick, and he ended up reffing and wrestling for Eddie Einhorn in future cards. This was at the Outdoor Roosevelt Stadium show, but Thez brought the true Ricky Starr, who we started marking out for. He had a long ponytail, and I don't know if I sent either one of you guys the photos, but I posed Sam with a mic, mock interviewing Thez, Neil Moskris, and Ricky Starr. What an unlikely grouping there, and I think you guys might enjoy those photos. And I posed Sam with almost everybody, Bulldog Brower and Johnny Powers and Inoki, who came to kind of spy and see what was happening on that first of 3 1975 Roosevelt Stadium IWA shows, where Einhorn said or claimed, a la Herb Abrams, he was taking on Sam Munchnick's NWA and Vince Sr.'s Tri-WF. It kind of fizzled after 2 years. He came back as the money mark again 10 years later for Pro Wrestling America, uniting and having NWA and AWA, mostly in the Tri-States area, doing shows in 85, a good decade later after he'd done this. So very unusual guy. And again, you guys know Eddie Einhorn was co-owner, part owner of Rich does, of the White Sox.
Stephen, one last question. Is Bob Ellis dead or alive? I've heard both. Gotta be one or the other.
I haven't heard from a reliable source that he's no longer with us. So, but sometimes news just doesn't get out.
He is still, after Firpo and some other guys, a gentleman in Mexico passed. If Bob Ellis is still alive, he's the oldest living pro wrestler. He was to have come.
You just said if. It's got to be one or the other.
Well, he was to have come. He was supposed to be our top honoree at Cauliflower Alley in like '97 and didn't show at the last minute. And the late Carl Lauer claimed that Bob was on the lam from the IRS, a la Ray Stevens, for a brief period of time when he wasn't paying his taxes. So I didn't know if that was legit. But I'm hoping Bob Ellis was at the IWA shows. He was paired with Nelson Royal as two cowboys. And I even photographed Ellis, obviously, with Menaker because of the history in St. Louis and the history in WWA, Indianapolis.
All right, Mike. Yeah, we got to wrap this up. So
all right.
We'll see everybody
when
next
you talk
week
about
today.
Legends, you can't stop talking. So
I know, and it's great to have you guys on the show. We'll have you guys on again when you have your next book ready or next big project. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Good night.